Welcome to Insight Notion. This is a two-part series titled Enough is Enough. Take action, not sides. In this series, I bring you a special conversation around the gun violence epidemic, a complex issue that will not be solved overnight and that will require each of us to lean in and do our part as a society. You will learn whether this is truly a divided issue, the challenges not only we as a society face, but also our politicians battle, and the validity of whether gun violence is a mental health issue, among other eye opening facts surrounding gun violence and reform. For part one of this series, I am joined by Arizona Republic opinion journalist Greg Moore and licensed professional counselor of In-Ward Counseling Center, Monica Pineda, to begin the conversation of the gun violence epidemic. Thank you for joining me here today on this conversation, which we'll be having with regards to I'm calling it an epidemic of mass shootings. It's a large issue that many are avoiding to have a conversation on. And I think if not now, then when is it going to be a good time to have this difficult conversation and bring awareness and ask those hard questions? With this past weekend, before that, we were just shy of 250 mass shootings already for the year, Greg. This last weekend, I lost count how many mass shootings happened. And one of those actually happened here in Phoenix, in Arizona, like actually not too far down from where I live. And I'm in the downtown area. So, and it's just increasing and has doubled from the beginning of the year in January, where it was 34 in the month. And for May, which is horrifying to say, that total to 61 mass shootings. So, and we're just starting June in just over a weekend. That's probably a half a dozen shootings that happened over the weekend. So there's an increase as well from 2014 to 2021 of nearly 40% increase in mass shootings. That just makes my skin cringe, makes me cringe. And what I want to ask is, how can we as a society prevent from going numb in such an impactful, events, which is mass shootings? And yeah, how can we not become numb? Because like I mentioned, it's becoming an epidemic. And this should not be happening anywhere in the world. And the United States is the only country that experiences mass shooting at such a high level.
Yeah. I mean, it's a scary thing if you just stop and think about it. For me, the thing that is the scariest is the locations. Malcolm Gladwell, author I've been reading for a while now, he's written some tremendous stuff. And he wrote something recently, a couple of years ago now. He said that the scariest thing, one of the scarier things about it, is it used to be you had to have a sick mind to come up with the idea of a mass shooting. But now everybody can have the idea of a mass shooting because it happens so frequently. Completely normal, otherwise healthy people are forced to contemplate this grotesque action, this horrible thing. And if anybody is outside of the protection of the group, right? If anybody feels like an outsider, if anybody feels like they don't fit in, this thought has the ability to get into their head. To me, I worry that we're going to lose something really, really important if we just don't have a basic sense of safety when we just do everyday normal things.
Yes, I agree with the sense of safety, because now it's having to come to that on a daily basis, having to have your guard up, and is it going to happen here, going to the movies, and when was a few years ago before the pandemic, when the shooting happened in Colorado in the movie theater. I was even scared to go to movie theaters for a while because, is it gonna happen here, or even in the malls? We've had several, shootings here and in the malls, and it hasn't happened in the movie theater, thankfully, but we've had that here. So this should not have to become a norm, and it freaking scares me. Like, It really does, because I don't know if it's going to affect me, it's going to affect a family member, and it's scary.
The Batman shooting was terrible up in Aurora. I think that was 2011 or 12, maybe 2012. The thing that was scary about that one, if you remember the details, the gunman had opened a door at the front of the theater and tossed in a smoke bomb, and it was the premiere of the movie. And so people who were at the theater thought that it was like a stunt, like it was part of the premiere.
Mm-hmm.
This guy just mowed people down right there in their seats. Just a horrifying thought. The question is, what do you do with the fear and the frustration and the anxiety and the agony and all of these emotions that come and that are normal to come in a situation such as this? What do you do to channel that stuff? Where I think the optimism comes from is that, let's say you don't like this. You, Joanna, can start a network and start having the conversation. And then ideas can come out of that. And people who watch this might have ideas of their own for how to help. There are people who are brilliant artists and they paint signs that say, do something, or El Paso strong. And that lets everybody know that they're all thinking the same direction. When you're on Twitter, you're on Instagram, you can post a tile that says, hey, this is too much, we've got to do something. And now people are able to understand that the feelings that they have don't exist in a vacuum, they're not alone. And now you can take that and turn it into action. The action could be that the politicians who represent you aren't voting with your interests in mind. You can write them letters, you can organize rallies, you can organize marches, you can vote them out of office, you can vote against them and let them know that you're displeased with their decision making. You can further support the elected officials who you did vote into office, who are reflecting your interests. You can make certain that you're following up in local elections to make sure that those elections are going the way that you want them to go, to support the policies. The mental health services, right? A lot of these shooters tend to be young men. So what's going on with young men that they aren't getting the attention and the opportunities and the mental health care and the resources necessary to keep them from going so far off the rails? Let's assume you think the answer is in policy. You can start to really push to make sure that you have to be over 21 to purchase certain types of weapons, or maybe to ban other types of weapons altogether. You can educate yourself, you can have local conversations. Like, there's lots of different ways to attack the problem. You don't have to just sit back and wait for somebody else to come in, swoop in and solve it. It's a complex problem. We're not going to solve it overnight. But if enough people start taking enough action, that creates the tide and that can create the change.
Yes, Greg, you mentioned a lot of key factors there. One is mental health, which in one aspect, yes, mass shootings is related to that. But the other, even if it is related to mental health, there, for whatever reason, they don't have the help, or maybe they don't know that they're suffering from mental health illness. That's another complex issue in itself. The other thing is, like you're saying, action in our state representatives. There are a couple of bills out there. One is HR 8, which Steve Kerr mentioned during that press conference in that game after the Golden State Warriors, which for me, that was, oh, let me look into this. And a lot of people we weren't aware that there's this bill that's been presented and been, just stagnant, just on the tabled for over a year. Finally, action was taken at the end of May. So now it's going for vote. It's on the calendar. I don't have a specific date. Now, congressman from California presented Protecting Our Children Act to going with what you mentioned, raising the age of purchasing weapons, guns, and maybe even limiting, probably could be added in there, like you mentioned. And it's a thought that I've had is, raising the age from 18 to 21. How is it that you can not buy alcohol at 21, but you can till 21, but you can go ahead and buy a weapon at 18. So that's
You
really
know,
not doesn't make sense.
I think the Steve Kerr example is particularly helpful. If you'll remember, that was right before a game, right? Was it Golden State, Dallas? It was right
Mhm.
before a game, and Steve Kerr said, "Look, we're not talking about basketball. This is what we're going to talk about." And when you're watching the game on TNT inside the NBA, then Shaq starts talking about different roles of law enforcement. Charles Barkley starts talking about mental health. I mean, you've got people who have these massive platforms that don't have anything to do with politics, but they're willing and able to speak up and say, hey, this is bothering me as a human being. And again, look at what that did. That created movement on something that was otherwise stagnant just because people are speaking up. And I think that that's just such a valuable thing. It's just a source, a wonderful source of optimism. Who knows, man? Maybe we start talking more and more about it and more ideas come out. What if you know, if any parts of your income comes from weapons manufacturers, maybe you're not allowed to have a say so on a bill such as this. You know, we've heard about red flag laws, of course. Red flag laws being that, hey, if you think that there's a problem, you can alert law enforcement. Law enforcement can go in and submit somebody for an evaluation. Listen, all of this stuff gets really tricky, and it gets tricky really quickly because, well, if you do this, then what about that? And if you do that, then what about this other thing? But the conversation is all going the right direction, which is to say we want people to be able to be more safe. Potentially, this is a job creator. What if you're somebody who's, you know, pro Second Amendment? You don't want to see any restrictions on weapons whatsoever. What if this is the kind of thing that says, okay, we are going to position armed guards at schools and we're going to integrate them into schools differently? And what if that's a job creator? What if this is something where you redesign the way schools are set up and now you start knocking schools down and rebuilding them and all of a sudden you've got construction, blue collar jobs? Again, the goal here is to keep focused on the big picture solution, to recognize that there are any number of potential ways to start to make progress toward that solution, and then figure out what your niche is. So maybe you lost somebody in one of these shootings. Maybe your niche is to stand up in front of Congress and give everybody a piece of your mind in a way that is so raw and so emotional that it makes people who haven't been affected by this stuff feel it differently. Maybe you are a lawmaker and you care. Maybe you can start writing different types of legislation. Maybe you can start changing some laws and moving things in a different direction. But again, it's a complex problem. That means the solution is going to be complex. And potentially the solution could lend itself toward job creation. Potentially the solution could tentacle out and have a lot of different applications. And again, if you mentioned mental health care, if you're making it better for affected 18-year-olds who are considering shooting up a school because they can't get a date, they were shunned, they can't get a job, they're poorly educated, anything that helps them helps everybody, right? So there's a lot of different ways we can attack this as long as we don't quit, as long as we don't give up hope, as long as we don't give up an ability to see a better future.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think, with what you've touched on, having that conversation and starting to have those conversations, and for those that do have a platform that they can speak on, like for instance, this last weekend, I just could not, I just had enough after everything that's happened and it continues to happen, and I had to just voice myself. Yes, I am a journalist, but then also I want to have a voice for those that don't have a voice or are too scared to speak out, which then that turned into, you know what, let me write something and just get it out there and educate people. But that grew a life of its own, which then prompted me to reach out, and you being one of those people, let's have this conversation. And yes, how conversations are being had, but sometimes they're not hard enough or they're not raw enough to be able to go ahead and have an impact. We'll be interviewing Senator Martin Quesada and then also gubernatorial candidate, Democratic candidate Marco Lopez, who touch on the subject and ask them questions, and maybe, hey, what are the challenges also that you are facing, being that you're someone that can actually make an impact, but maybe that we are not aware of what we don't see among many, some of the things that we've touched on, because it's important to have that conversation now and educate and bring awareness.
But I'm curious to hear what the people who hope to make a dent through public service and public policy, they have more obstacles than the rest of us are going to face. And again, I think the solution is going to come from regular, everyday people implementing things on a local level. I believe that the future can be better than tomorrow than it is today. And so it's up to me to imagine how that's going to be possible and how I might be able to contribute to it. My role is to do like you, is to talk, is to educate myself, to write, to explain something complex in a way that people who might otherwise not be interested, that they learn about it. That's my role. And I'm hopeful that other people find their role and find ways to, make the difference that they want to see.
Yes, and I think you hit it there. Is we have to think outside the box, because of it. Obviously, what the norm and the day to day, creating public policies, or going with the law and trying to create laws is not working, and it's being blocked too. So, no one can find a common ground. It's become a divided issue, not only as a society, but also, with our public servants in within government. So we have to think outside the box and how this is going to work. The other issue here, well, two things that also, just going to with the mass shootings and that aspect, we did cover mental health, but it also, when we didn't get into this, is in some bases, in some of the shootings like El Paso, Buffalo, South Carolina, just to mention a few of those, also tied to racism, which is
Sure.
a whole other, vortex there. And then the other aspect, which I think where this is comes to a major halt, and why also has become such a divided issue with weapons, with guns, is money. I think that's where the nitty gritty lies on.
Yeah. I think the trick right now is to do what you can with what you have, right? Just get it going. We're not going to solve racism easily. It's just not going to be easy to solve. People have been dealing with it for the last, however long humans have existed. And we're finally getting to a place where we can say, hey, genetically speaking, the differences between the races it's not even worth discussing. And we're hoping that kind of turns the tide of conversation in a new way. It's so big, it's so complicated, and it's so easy to worry that it'll never change, or that we've got to hide, or that we can't come outside, or that racism is so deadly and so pervasive that it's going to just wipe us all out. Valid fears, valid concerns based on what we're looking at. But if we just take this thing apart piece by piece, bit by bit, and just look at what areas of it we're equipped to attack, what areas of it we're equipped to work on, I do think that we can start to see some new types of progress. It's scary, and it's going to be scary, but this is the world that we live in. And if we accept that, that's where we can start to make some changes.
Yes, I think we started in a right place in starting to have a conversation, and where we could hopefully lead others to do the same and make a dent, at least, in
Yeah.
trying to make that change. It's
It's
not going
mental
to be
health for
easy.
me. It's mental health. If I was to attack one thing and it wasn't writing, for me it'd be mental health. Because I don't think you fight guns with more guns. I think you try to make sure that the people who are predisposed to doing this sort of thing are less likely to do it, because they feel like they've got other resources, other avenues, other ways of settling and calming themselves. I would start there.
Yeah, definitely. Just bring that awareness, not to one thing, because it's not related. Just let's just not focus on, okay, let's create a law or a policy to abolish or to prevent this or that. it's deeper than that.
Again, for me, there's a complex problem, which means there are lots of different ways to attack it. But I'm so grateful that we're in an environment where people can present solutions that you wouldn't expect. Nobody saw that coming when Steve Kerr said, I'm not talking about basketball during the NBA playoffs, and went right into potential solutions and his own sense of frustration. Shaq, Charles Barkley, Kenny Smith, Ernie Johnson on TNT, when they stopped talking about basketball, went right into it. I saw a clip somebody sent me of Stephen A. Smith presenting potential solutions. We are all citizens of society. That means we all have a responsibility to fixing this problem. And I'm grateful to be able to see people find their own voices and their own ways to make progress. And I can't wait to see what the elected officials or potential elected officials have to tell you when you speak to them in the near future. What about you, Joanna? Wrap it up.
Yeah, so I think just this is a start in what we're doing, not only as journalists, but just as just mentioned, citizens of society, taking a step forward, being a voice, voicing out our thoughts, opinions, solutions, like we are doing here in this platform, educating ourselves, learning more, like Steve Kerr, that was for me one thing that, oh, there's actually something out there. It's just nothing being done about it. Now it's being pushed. Congressman Mike Thompson from California presented a new bill, the Protect Our Children Act, learning more about that, and maybe pushing for our own elected officials to do something, whether maybe if it's not has to do anything with public policy, but something that they can help within the community to provide services, or something that can help with mental health. We know that that's one of the stemming issues related to mass shootings. So we mentioned it's a complex issue, but at least getting in that route. And for me, one of the things is not only educating myself, educating others, and utilizing this platform to go ahead and be able to have these conversations and see what more I can go ahead and provide to society.
Let me give you one last thing to think about. A lot of people are going to talk about potential federal legislation and get bogged down in the Senate because the Senate's in gridlock, because the Republicans move in lockstep and the Democrats are having a hard time moving anything forward on any of their agendas because Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona has been unwilling to change her stance on the filibuster. For whatever it's worth, I think the filibuster probably is an important protection. I don't want to see the filibuster changed, primarily because I don't want to see people I disagree with get in power and then have that much ability to railroad the rest of the process. But if you think there's gridlock in Congress, if you think that the senators aren't doing their job, which is to represent the people as opposed to just making sure that their side wins, pull them out, right? We've seen that in a state like Georgia. The right activists with the right inspiration, with the right message, that being Stacey Abrams, can take an otherwise red state and turn it blue. If that can happen in 10 more places, if you feel like the Democrats have your best interests in mind and that an ability to have a Congress that can pass some functional laws, that gives you an opportunity. Maybe you want to get in to make sure that that party has an ability to make more inroads. Maybe you feel like the independent voice is not out there. Maybe you feel like we need to have a 3-party system. Maybe you feel like we need to have a different primary system so that fewer extreme or fewer fringe candidates make it into power in your given state. There are so many ways to get involved, whether they're socially, business-wise, whether it's political. It just takes a matter of being willing to dive in on an interest, on an area that you might not feel that you otherwise are an expert in. And again, the athletes, the coaches, Steve Kerr, Barkley, Shaq, speaking up, these guys, doing that should maybe empower and inspire the rest of us to say, yo, if the jocks can do it, I can do it. And if the politicians sound like idiots, maybe I can say something better, and we can start to reflect. We don't have to be powerless in this thing, is all I'm saying. We're not powerless. I'm interested to see what happens next.
Yeah, the only way we are powerless is by keeping quiet and doing nothing. So we've had enough of that and enough of the inaction of nothing being done or not holding those that need to accountable. And now is the time. So I think this is a great start for us to go ahead and push for that change.
Sure. Well, listen, thank you for reaching out. Thank you for the conversation. Greg Moore, opinion journalist, Arizona Republic. Thank you. I appreciate it.
No, thank you, Greg. I know I pulled you out a little from your vacation to do a little work related
It's all good.
content,
It's
but
all good. We're just
great
having a
stuff.
conversation that needs to be had. There's no worries. Anything I can do to help. Thank you for thinking of me. I
Of
appreciate
course,
it.
thank you. I am with Monica Pineda, licensed professional counselor and owner of Inward Counseling Center. Thank you for joining me today in this conversation that we're having with regards to the epidemic of gun violence. How are you today?
Good. Thank you for having me on, Joanna. It's such an important topic, and so I'm not going to lie, a little nervous because there's so much to this topic.
Definitely, there's so much. It is very complex. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into the conversation, and I want to go ahead and lead off with the blame on gun violence and mass shootings has been placed on mental health. So how much validity is in that belief from society?
You know, it's really easy for us to blame any complex event on one single thing because it's easier. It makes us feel better that we can just blame it on one thing. But it's such a complex event and it requires multiple solutions and angles. So I'll kind of break it down a little bit in that there are pieces that are mental health related, and there are other pieces like access to a weapon that makes it easier to be able to commit a violent act against people. And so it's kind of twofold in a way, and we can't only look at one side of it. We have to look at both sides and everything that we can do at the same time, kind of short term and also long term. And so there is research from professors that was done for the Department of Justice 3 years ago or so, and they did look at the profile of a mass shooter, of individuals and the things that are underlying that contribute to their behavior later on. And that's important for us to look at, and maybe what we can do in prevention and how we can intervene and work warning signs that might be for us to look at. And that's just one side of the puzzle, because not everybody with a mental health issue has violent thoughts and actions. And so we're really looking at pieces to the puzzle here to figure this one out.
Yes, thank you for elaborating on that and saying that it's, just educating us that it's such more larger than that, and that everyone that does suffer from a mental health issue doesn't necessarily go to a violence aspect of that. And when it comes to mass shootings or in incidents, how can those affected by such trauma ask for help in to cope and recover?
Yes, this it's such a traumatic event, and it's so normal to have such a significant response and maybe even a mixed response to these events. One of the biggest things is to speak up, to talk about it with the people around you, to really pay attention to what you're feeling and what you're thinking, what's coming up for you, and whether that's parents, friends, that our support system, we're tapping into that. Especially when we're talking about children, because it's hard for them to do that. And so as adults, we have to kind of create the space for them to feel safe, like they can talk. And we as adults have to feel like we can actually have that conversation, help them, hug them, and also seek support as adults, because these are difficult feelings and events that we don't come across every day. That's challenging to kind of figure out how to help them feel safer and move forward.
Yes, and you touched on feelings there, and as a society, it's coming to come to kind of living in fear of this, unfortunately. And how can we avoid doing that, going, living in fear of going out in public and avoid the thoughts of when is my city going to be next, or am I going to be
Mm,
next, and or am I going to be impacted in one some way by an incident, uh that can be gun violence or a mass shooting, because we don't want to live in fear. So how can that be avoided?
Um, this is such a reality, right, that we're facing. Like, I wish I could say that we can avoid fear, um, but fear is an emotion, and it is a response when we feel threatened by our safety. And so we have to do two things at the same time, kind of like just this. I'm hearing it now more and more, right? We have to do multiple things at the same time. And even in this sense, we are both um, feeling the fear and knowing that it is a sign telling us that we need to be careful, that things are going on, because we don't feel safe in this world because things are happening, and there maybe aren't lots of safety measures yet in place that make it maybe harder for people to hurt people and whatnot. And so facing this reality that this is real and starting to trust in our environment by us as adults and community members and in the spaces, whether it's schools, whether it's workplaces, any other settings, that we can talk in ways that are safer and have plans around safety, and we can start to feel that sense of safety again, um, is necessary in order for us to not necessarily walk around on eggshells left and right if there's going to be another attack or it could happen to us.
And I want to go ahead and take it one step further in how, as a society, I can be avoided to becoming numb to these type of
Mm,
incidents. This is something that over the years has increased, and this is something you didn't have to, for generations before, have to worry about, and then now it's having that be a norm. So how can we avoid going numb to this?
um, Numbing is such a response to stress and a way that we try to cope by not having to feel, maybe, or not having to necessarily um, accept what's going on. We can go into numbing and kind of deny what's happening and continue on with our lives. And so when we think of it from that angle, we can start to see that we're really disconnecting from what's happening, and that our body and our mind is trying to figure out how to make sense of this so we can keep living in this world. And so what's really important is that we identify that, lately we have been so disconnected. We maybe feel like we don't care, or we can just give ourselves an answer and move on. And identifying that allows us to start to work through all the other feelings that are under there, like fear and the reality that this horrific event has happened, and the reality that these are real issues happening in society that we can actually do a lot of things about. And so the more that we start to face the reality and the feelings, we can start to talk more about and work through them and start to feel better about this situation, that it's not as helpless or as hopeless as it seems. Um, and so talking and feeling along with support, it's kind of hard usually for most of us to feel things and talk about things without really having the support or the space that we feel like it's okay to do so, that we can cope with what we're feeling and kind of the magnitude of these big events.
Yeah. And with that, you mentioned taking some type of action. And a lot of schools and maybe even businesses, they're now having active shooter drills, which is something that they're implementing or are even thinking about implementing. Those that don't have it is just going back to generations past, you didn't have to worry about it. You didn't have to, really have that in the back of your mind. Tornado drills, earthquake drills, fire drills, etc. But now active shooter drills. So how impactful can this be, especially to young children or just as a human being, to have to, now this is something you have to worry about and you have to practice this type of drill and in a way also consider that you have to fear for your safety.
Absolutely. This is a very reactive kind of response to active shooters situations, right? Where we are doing the drills in order to prepare for it to possibly happen. And so while the purpose of it is that we're a little bit more, we've got a plan, we kind of know what to do if and when this happens, it's very reactive. We're almost on guard waiting that, ready in case of whenever it happens. And while there's some merit, I guess, to that, it would be so much, I would say, preventative to address the other things we can do instead of just introducing active shooter drills into schools or some other measures that might be reactive in a sense versus preventative.
And just to go ahead and close out the conversation, what is something that you would like to share with those that are learning or wanting to know more as far as in a mental health aspect, or even just relating to this conversation?
I would say that for me, from a mental health aspect, I would really like to put out there this idea that we can do so much more before even sending people to counseling necessarily. We talk a lot about access to counseling and counseling really helping people work through things. But before counseling, we have crisis situations. Before people seek counseling services and get into therapy to work through things, we have lots of environments where we can just support one another and talking about stress and working on some of these other issues that are sometimes underlying to bigger events. And so I would encourage us who are in the field, not in the field, to have these conversations, to collaborate, to see, all the other ways that we can support one another, that we're not alone in this, even when we're kind of looking and seeing that there's these laws that are getting passed or getting looked at, right, in order to address gun violence and the age that you can get a weapon, the red flag laws to inform somebody when there might be a threat against them, that even then we need support from one another to not be scared, that we can kind of speak up and have less fear when we're speaking up and talking about these things in a collaborative and supportive way with one another.
Yes, support is a key factor here when relating to this type of conversation, and just as a society to support each other. So yeah, very important. Thank you very much for having this conversation with me, and I look forward to many more.
Thank you as well for providing the space for it.
Thank you for tuning into Insight Notion, expanding your notion beyond the ordinary. Visit our website at insightnotion.com and download the Insight Notion podcast from wherever it is you listen to podcasts.